Order, order. Good afternoon. Today we're holding our first oral evidence session in our inquiry into elections in the House of Commons. In 2010, our predecessor committee recommended that the 3 deputy speakers of the House of Commons should be elected by the whole House in secret ballot. And this year marks 15 years since those first elections took place, which provides us with a really good opportunity to examine the rules governing those elections now that the House has been through multiple election cycles to see whether the arrangements remain fit for purpose. So today, my fellow committee members and I are delighted to be joined by 2 former deputy speakers of the House of Commons, Natascha Engel and Baroness Primarolo, both of whom were elected under the system designed by our predecessors. And we're very grateful of the opportunity to hear more about their experiences of being elected to those roles in the House of Commons and of participating on such elections to the House. Good afternoon to you both. Before we start this afternoon's session, I would be grateful if you would be able to introduce yourselves formally for the record.
My name is Baroness Primarolo, and I was elected as a deputy in 2010.
And I'm Natascha Engel, and I was elected in 2015 and lost my seat in 2017, so 2 short but glorious years.
Thank you so much for that. As is traditional, I'm going to start with the first question about the nomination process. I wondered if you could tell me and the committee how you found the nomination process. Did you have any issues getting the required level of support from members across the House? I'll let you choose first.
I'm going to be very brief because actually my election was slightly different because I was elected unopposed. So it was really just the nomination process that was significant. And I found that quite good. The barrier was quite high, which suited me at the time. But basically the sort of having to have 2 members from the government side and 2 members from the opposition side, I thought that it seemed very low, but it wasn't, and it actually really helped to make sure that you did have support across the House. For me, I thought the nomination process was relatively straightforward and worked very well. The only bit was that, and I don't know how this works now, but if you have somebody who nominates 2 people, you wouldn't know. And so I think a lot of people were sort of overcompensating by getting more people onto their nomination forms, because otherwise, after the closed nominations, obviously it's too late. And I wonder whether there's anything that can be done about that. But that was really my only observation on the nomination process.
Thank you. Dawn.
In 2010, because it was the first time the deputies were going to be elected, there was quite a lot of interest in it. Because, as you know, before the recommendations of the Procedure Committee, deputies emerged, decided by the whips. And the reforms proposed as well by the Right Committee reforms really interested incoming MPs, new MPs. There were a lot of them in 2010, not as many as last year, but a lot. And so there was discussion around the fact that we were going to be able to elect the deputies as well as the Speaker. So I didn't experience any difficulties getting the required number of nominations, and I look back at the booklet that was circulated, and it does have who nominated you. And it was very important at the time to make sure that actually the nominations had a party spread as well, because of the intention that, one, you should only have serious candidates, i.e. that stood a chance of getting elected, hence the bar was quite high. And also you were going to have to demonstrate support across the whole House, not just through the voting mechanism of STV, but you have to command the confidence of the House, not just your own side, if you're going to chair debate. So no, I didn't personally, and I don't think anybody else did, because from memory, I think there were 9 candidates on that occasion, and they all got the required number of nominations.
My colleague Joy's got a question.
On the back of the booklet that you mentioned, so they did print a hard copy booklet when you were standing for the first, when you stood, and did you also take your 500-word supporting statement, and was that sort of published widely throughout the House as well? And did you produce any additional campaign material?
Okay. Do you want me to go for this? Yeah. There's quite a lot of questions there, so if I forget one of them, please, no, I will answer them. Please come back and ask me. Yes, to your first question, there were photographs, who we were sponsored by, and our either statement or CV. And the statement was very strict, and I know we might talk about perhaps compare and contrast with select committee chairs. The deputies weren't allowed to have a manifesto because we weren't campaigning in our own right to say how we would like to see the House develop, although everybody said they signed up to the right committee reports. It was to be part of a team that had specific responsibilities along with the Speaker. So the discussion was much more around your suitability in terms of experience, your understanding of how the Chamber operated, and informal discussions, but there were hustings as well. But we weren't allowed, and I don't know where this came from, we were not allowed campaign material. You had to be there and questioned by MPs. This is just for the deputy speakers. I think, obviously select committee chairs is an entirely different job, so I can understand why it's a bit different.
Did you have several hustings or just one?
I think, from recollection, I think there were 2. And they were very well attended, and all the candidates were there. And you weren't allowed to stand up and make a long statement and use up all the time. You could just introduce yourself, say a few points. There were private meetings, and then you would take questions.
Hey, Graham, did you have any follow-up questions about hustings?
Yeah, I think just on that, when you were talking about it, so I understand why the procedure was maybe a little bit different than this for select committees, and you weren't standing on platforms so much, but what were the kind of questions that came up at the hustings, and did you find them valuable, or did you get any feedback afterwards that people had found them valuable?
Obviously we were all circulating and talking constantly because we were waiting for the coalition to be formed, and the then Queen's speech was in September. So there are a lot of members around generally talking about reforms. From my point of view, I can only speak personally, my experience was I'd been a backbencher, I'd been a shadow minister, and then I had been a government minister for 13 years. And I had a pretty good idea how the Chamber works. And, backbenchers are going to push at the envelope, at the edges, because they want to get their point across. Shadow ministers are there to do a particular job, and ministers to get their legislation through. So the discussion was around, one, whether that was relevant experience. Secondly, really, whether somebody who had been a government minister could, this is personal to me, could demonstrate that equal-handedness in debates. And I did find that very helpful, and it forced me to think more and more about the Chamber itself and what we expect it to do to show off a parliamentary democracy at its very best.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, so we didn't have hustings because there was only Lindsay and myself, and the big question when this all happened in 2015 was Lindsay was Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and I was not interested in challenge. So it literally went whoever, with the Speaker being a Conservative, it meant that the chair of Ways and Means had to be Labour, or had to be opposition party. What happened was I was not interested in being chair of Ways and Means, so I was quite happy just to say, let's just let that go. But we had to have an election. So I was in this bizarre situation where I was sort of saying to people, I'm really not interested, so do please vote for Lindsay first. Which is it's a bit of a topsy-turvy situation. But I tell you what, we didn't have a hustings because there was no question about that. And I actually think it would have been really helpful, because I think with hustings, it's like job interviews. It's like what you were saying, Dawn, that with job interviews, you actually get to sort of really think about what it is that you want to do, why have you put yourself forward, what kind of Deputy Speaker might you be, your motivations, and you're absolutely right, no campaign materials, because you were the deputies to the Speaker, you were just in a sort of support capacity. But there are differences in the way that deputies behave in the chair. Some are very... Some are very strict. We were just talking about the stricter deputy speakers in history. Some of them less so. But there are definitely different styles. Some are real sticklers for procedure, but that kind of thing does come out in a hustings, and it also makes you think about things that you might not have thought about before. So I felt after the election, where Lindsay was chair of Ways and Means, I did feel quite unprepared. So I think hustings are a real benefit if that situation ever occurred again.
Mock chamber sessions for future
election. Honestly, that would have been great.
If we can just pick up one small point for Dawn, who kind of mentioned that previously it was the whips who had essentially chosen the deputy speakers. Did either of you detect any kind of dead hand of front benches or whips still in your own selections when it came through? Either to stand or during, obviously you're a bit different, you didn't have an election, but yeah, almost makes me more suspicious.
No, definitely not. And I think what you were just saying about that period between a general election and the government forming, it's sort of a bit dead time. And actually that was sort of, the whips are very busy doing other stuff, like getting roles in the whip's office. There's definitely other things that were more important to do. And I don't think, I don't think there was any real issue about either Lindsay or myself. So definitely not. I would say no.
Almost that same for you.
I agree with Natascha. I didn't sense any of that. In fact, the reverse. I felt people were very open with me, and those who thought it wasn't, given my ministerial experience, even on the Labour side, were quite blunt with me. And again, whether they thought that wasn't appropriate, I actually think it's good to have an understanding of the chamber, and we all have roles in there, and backbench members in particular really struggle and they need to get their voices heard, and sometimes they're going to maybe overstep the mark. And how you sort of rebalance that and pull them back without humiliating them or whatever is something you have to learn. So I didn't experience that. I don't know whether we're going to, I don't want to get ahead, come on to the gender issue. I've got some things to say.
I think we may. So I mean, we are going to have slightly quicker answers and maybe slightly shorter questions if we're going to keep to time. So Lee's going to demonstrate that for me.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Dawn and Natascha. So do you think a longer period between the closing of nominations and the actual election taking place would impact either the election process or the candidates in any way?
I actually don't think so. And I think also, this is also with chairs of select committees, but I think that there's those people who are returning members have got a huge advantage over those who are new members, who are sort of finding their feet. I mean, however well you know this place, it's quite daunting when you first come in. So actually, I think the sort of, maybe with such a vast new intake, that might have been different. Maybe a longer time would have been better. But certainly when I did it, I thought that time was just about right. And again, there was a lot of sort of finding offices and, sort of quite a lot of dead time. So there was quite a lot of opportunity to speak to people. So I thought it was okay. Thanks,
Natascha. Anything to add, Dawn?
I think it was quite unusual for us because we were waiting for the coalition to be formed, and so there was a gap, firstly. And I think the question of if one wanted more hustings as a way of newer members getting to know the candidates, then the time period was quite short. I didn't think it impeded discussion, and what we have to remember is it's an absolute imperative to get the Speaker and his or her team in place as fast as possible to start the process of Parliament operating properly. So I didn't experience that, but if you had a hustings slotted in, you might need a few days more.
Thank you very much.
Mary.
Thank you. Did you fully understand the single transferable vote system that was used in the election ahead of you taking part? And second question is, did other members come to you to raise concerns around the system or even ask advice on how it worked just to ensure that their preferred candidate got across the line?
I didn't have any questions to me about the system. I think, obviously, if people don't use all their votes, that does affect the weighting in the system, but it's as best as it can be. And actually, members of Parliament, even new ones, pretty up to speed on voting systems. So no, I don't think that caused any issues at all that I can recollect.
No, not at all.
You obviously fully understood it as well. Anyway,
There's no exam question on describing different forms of STV, though.
Reading the results is a bit more tricky.
Thanks. Gurinder.
Thank you. Do you think the cross-party requirement of the election are an important aspect of the whole system, and that should be retained?
The cross-party nature of it, yeah. I think that was really important, and I think that is probably the most important bit of being Deputy Speaker, is that that you do have the support of both sides of the House. And it is quite difficult when you come from a political party and you've been a political party politician to get across that that you are neutral when you're in the chair. And I think maybe we will talk a bit about smaller parties, but I think now that there are more smaller parties in Parliament, I think that really is something that ought to be considered in terms of getting more involvement and engagement from smaller parties, I think. But yeah, I think that's very important.
I completely agree with that. I would only add one rider, that it's very important after the election how the deputies behave going forward in terms of their discussions and meetings, which they can do, and having an open door policy for either one of the smaller parties or for individual members of Parliament who feel they might not be being treated fairly, to actually be able to come and make that direct. So there is a role post-election as well.
Tracy.
This is to touch on the point that you had raised on the highest number of women MPs sitting in this Parliament at 40%, and the 3 deputy speakers all being women. Do you still think there's a requirement to keep that balance of at least having one voted in?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, of course I do. I was just thinking 4 women deputies with the Speaker, and I think it is important, and I think it's just accepted now. But in 2010, it did cause some disagreement amongst some members of Parliament that they felt that why did they have to vote for at least one woman? And of course, because of the way the weighting of the system goes, they don't absolutely have to. But I think it's just taken as read now, as far as I can see. In fact, we never thought it would go so quickly to be the reverse of 3 women and 1 man in the team of 4. But it's very good. Very good.
Thank you.
Michael.
Good afternoon. My understanding is that one of the concerns raised with our predecessor committee around the introduction of elections in the first place was that it might undermine the cohesion and the strong working relationships between the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker team as a whole by introducing that mildly partisan element. In your experience, were those concerns justified? Did they pan out that way? Or what was your experience as working as part of a team?
It's really fascinating, actually, because I found when I was... So it's like being elected. You're elected and suddenly you're the Deputy Speaker, and you're elected suddenly you're the MP, and it just kind of happens the minute the results are read out. And I found the whole experience kind of very... it's kind of real baptism of fire. I mean, you literally get put in the chair. I mean, the quiet moment is chosen, but it's still really, really daunting. But the first thing that happened was I went to the Deputy Speaker corridor. Dawn was still in her room, which then later became my room. But it was the handover and the sort of, and because Eleanor and Lindsay had been so experienced, and Dawn obviously also, it was really, really collegiate, really highly collegiate, and everybody works very, very closely together. Really supportive, and there was no sense of that you were from a political party. It was all, you were a Deputy Speaker team. So it was really fantastic, highly supportive. And if I couldn't be in the chair, there was always somebody else who could do it, or the other way around, if anybody was ill or whatever. There's absolutely no question. It was really just a sort of a team. So really fantastic. So yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. The 3 deputies worked really closely together. It was very collegiate, and we tried to help each other out when we knew that you had to get back to your constituency or there was something else. So I think that I understand that fear pre the election, but certainly that wasn't my experience. I mean, it is a small team, and inevitably there might be slightly different views about how something might be handled, but that is the day-to-day running of the House. There wasn't a problem at all.
Any potential friction wasn't a hangover from a competitive election then? It was...
Oh, I see. I didn't think of that. Well, if there was, it passed me by. No, I don't think so. Maybe you might ask Nigel when he's here a bit later, because he was... No, not at all. We were straight into doing what we'd been elected to do, and working together to deliver that.
James.
Okay, mine's a two-parter. So thinking back to your kind of time in the role and looking at the kind of the workload and the time pressures, whether you think there would be any value in having an additional deputy speaker, and if that were the case and we were having a 4th deputy, given the growth in the number of smaller parties and the size of them, the move away from 2 large parties only, whether there would be a value in having that 4th speaker reserved for the smaller parties, and if that were the case, would that cause any difficulties with cohesion with the team?
That's an interesting question. I would say, certainly when I was there, the speaker that we worked under was in the chair a lot. So there wasn't so much need for an additional speaker, but I know that in the sort of the more sort of the parliaments after 2017, there was so much more activity in the chamber that actually I think that looked like it was valuable, having that option of having a 4th deputy, and I do think, I mean, I don't know whether we're going to talk about the Backbench Business Committee, but the representation of minority parties was a really big issue in that, certainly in the Right Committee, which I sat on as well. But bringing the smaller parties in and giving them some kind of representation. I know they're very, very different, but having at least a sort of an acceptance, that an understanding that the minority parties do need a bit of representation. I think that could be really valuable.
I absolutely agree with Natascha. The speaker spent quite a lot of time in the chair himself when I was in the deputies team, and so sharing out the remainder on a rolling basis, taking the end of the day, the middle of the day, whatever. That was pretty straightforward. There was a period when I was deputy speaker where I had a hip replacement surgery, and so I was off for 6 weeks. But what then happened was Lindsay, Nigel and Speaker Burko, they covered me, and then arrangements were made for me to come back in 6 weeks rather than having longer. And we did shorter stints in the chair. So the answer to your question is that actually, I don't know, because one of the things about the speakers is that we're balanced. So we cancel each other out. We don't change the composition of the political forces, if you like, the parties in the chamber, and we don't vote. And if we increase the number, then that principle would need to be thought about. But I can't come up with a principled reason why we wouldn't. And I agree with Natascha on the point of smaller parties, if it's possible, without them thinking they're delegates, that they're only there to represent that particular view. I think there's value maybe in exploring that, but I haven't been able to think it all through myself. I don't know whether it would work.
That's really helpful.
It is.
Bambos.
In the recent elections for select committee chairs, we saw accusations of excessive canvassing by some candidates for these roles. Can you recall anything similar happening when you were voting for those elections, when you were, before you became deputy chairs?
So I was the chair of the Backbench Business Committee, and that was a new committee that came out of the Parliamentary Reform, the Right Committee, and so a lot of people didn't know what it was. And so a lot of people thought it was a business committee, as in business and trade, where actually it was House Business Committee, which I think this is quite a niche interest. And I think sort of the role of the Backbench Business Committee and why it was important was, again, it was kind of very parliamentary, and again, sort of very niche. But sort of explaining to people why that really mattered and why setting it up gave backbenchers an additional forum where they could kind of voice their views. So it was very different from the kind of campaigning that it was starting in our time. Well, it started when you had elections for select committee chairs, but I think it sounds completely bonkers now. But on the other hand, I think that is the danger of having elections, isn't it? I mean, and everyone around here knows that, campaign materials are very important to make the point. And if you don't campaign, you might not get elected. And I know it was one of your campaigns for this committee, so that does prove that having an anti-campaign campaign can sometimes also work. But I think that one of the things that really, really changed, and I don't know what you thought about this, but in the 2010 Parliament, when it was the first time that select committee chairs were being elected, it really changed the way that this place worked. And it's really difficult to think about it, but across parties, you didn't make eye contact with each other when you walked past each other. You stayed very much in your different parts of the tea room. And actually, this kind of made people, you suddenly became their electorate, and so they started talking to you. And I remember chairing the Backbench Business Committee, and it was only a couple of weeks in, and the requirement was that people had to come from different political parties, so it couldn't just be one political party coming to ask for a debate, and the first time where across parties people called each other honourable friend, and it was really, it sounds ridiculous, but it just was, I'd never heard it before, and it really changed the way that this place works. So, I mean, just be, you know, I just think the impact that it's had has been so positive. So that sometimes I think maybe just, you know, take the hit on the campaign materials. I used to keep them because they used to make me laugh when I was a bit depressed. Some of them were hilarious.
Them from the last cycle, and it's quite a stack, I tell you.
Yeah.
I agree entirely with that, and particularly the last point, which is since 2010, select committees have become more powerful, more influential and key in holding the government to account on decisions as well as policies and departments. And I think that that's added, you know, legitimacy, it's improved the status of the select committees, it's improved the status of Parliament, actually, to see that powerful, in my opinion, independent voice. And the chairs have to campaign on their vision of how they would lead the committee. And so again, I think, as Natascha said, maybe we should just take it on the chin, and the materials with it, because what we get is a very vibrant, important structures that hold the executive to account, and I think that can't be overstated.
Our final question is just for Natascha, actually, because it's about the Backbench Business Committee, and Lee's going to ask about that, if that's okay.
And you've talked really passionately about it already, Natascha. So I know you were the chair between 2010 and 2015, and that election is, I know that's conducted very differently to the other select committees that happen, that, you know, that being at the start of each session rather than for the duration of the Parliament. So did that electoral cycle, did that cause any issues in terms of effective working of the committees at the start of each session?
I didn't mind it. It was. I think the problem was that we had to prove that. So it really was an innovation, and it really changed how Parliament worked. And so it took. This is a real understatement, but it took the Whip's office and there's both Whip's offices. It took them quite a long time to get used to it. And I think they saw it as something really, really destructive at first, or something that sort of unbalanced things. But actually, it turned out to be something very, very positive, and it sort of gave backbenchers an outlet that they wouldn't, you know, there's either the option of abstaining, rebelling, voting for, but actually sort of airing, not even grievances, but ideas about different policies. In a more neutral sort of environment was really, it really worked. And I think once that was seen to work, and it was like a sort of a valve, you know, you sort of let off steam and then everything was all right. And I think once that happened, things changed quite a bit, and so there wasn't that concern anymore about would it really unhinge things. And so then, and I think I did again, it was elected unopposed. There weren't any elections. For me personally, and I know the other chairs have done it differently, but for me personally, because it was a new committee and it was quite successful, they tried to sort of load loads of other stuff onto it, like making decisions on private members' bills rather than having ballots, having petitions on the Backbench Business Committee. And so we spent pretty much the first 5 years just batting everything off. So we were sort of wanting not more powers, because actually the way that it worked was really good. It was for backbenchers and for all backbenchers. It wasn't a public engagement committee. It was, you know, and you know, if you start selecting private members' bills, you know, if you select 10, that's 640 members that will hate you. So, so we didn't want that. But it was, but yeah, I think it sort of worked itself out. Now it's a parliament, isn't it? Is the Backbench Business Committee chair still elected on a sessional basis?
Still by session.
Yeah,
Right,
okay. Yeah. And that is actually kind of my follow-on question, really.
Yeah.
So, you know, do you believe that the chair of the Backbench Business Committee should that be elected for the duration of the Parliament based on your experience?
Yes,
You
definitely.
do?
I'm sorry,
You do?
yes, I didn't realise that. So, yes, definitely. I just thought in that settling in period I could understand why they did it by session. And I think also while I was there, we established that the chair is a member of an opposition party, not the government party. I think that's important. But yeah, definitely, I would definitely have that. It makes no sense to have it every session now. It's established and, you know, it's like every other select committee.
Thank you, Natascha.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you both for all the evidence that you've given us this afternoon. And if there's anything you wish to add, please write to the committee, and we're very happy to take any further evidence in writing. We're now going to suspend the session very briefly to change over to the next panel. Order, order. Order, order. We now come to the second panel of today's session, and in this panel we are delighted to be joined by three more former Deputy Speakers, the Right Honourable Nigel Evans, Baroness Laing and Baroness Winterton. We're really grateful for the opportunity to be able to ask you questions about your experiences in your time in the role, and we'll also be asking you a few further questions that we didn't ask to the last panel around electronic voting and call lists, just given your experience as Deputy Speakers during the COVID-19 pandemic. I suspect you'll have very valuable insight for our committee on those issues. So good afternoon. Would you be able to introduce yourself for the record?
Yeah. My name's Nigel Evans. I was Deputy Speaker 2010, 2013, 2020, 2024.
I'm Eleanor Laing, now Baroness Laing. I was elected Deputy Speaker in a by-election when Nigel left for a little while. In 2013, I was then re-elected as Deputy Speaker in 2015 and 2017, and then in 2020 I was elected Chairman of Ways and Means, in which capacity I served until 2024.
Rosie Winterton, Baroness Winterton of Doncaster. I was elected Deputy Speaker in 2017, 2020 until 2024.
Thank you ever so much. And our first question is about the nominations process and how you found that. How easy was it to source the required number of nominations? And if I could also ask about whether or not you submitted a 500-word supporting statement for the elections booklet as well. Whichever one of you wants to go first.
Yeah, as Chairman of Ways and Means, it was normal for me to go first. They're very kind to me.
Know my place.
They're very, very kind to me. The simple answer to your question is I find the nominations system absolutely no problem at all. And I would suggest that if you can't get, how many was it, 8 or 10 nominations? How many do we need? Something like that, 10. If you can't get 10 people from across the House to happily and readily nominate you, then you shouldn't be standing. So that was pretty simple. And as to submitting 500 words, that was also pretty simple and straightforward, and it was quite useful to be able to say something, but not, as was said in the last session, a whole full-blown campaign, but to put out your case, your experience, etc.
And can I just ask, Eleanor, did you produce any additional campaign material alongside that, or was it just the 500 words?
Well, I do recall that, yes, I produced little cards which effectively just had my picture and the 500 words on them. But when I was clearing out my office the time of the election, I found hundreds and hundreds of them, so I obviously didn't do very much with those little cards. But I think it was rather different we'll come on to this later, I'm sure. These 4 elections in which I was elected were all quite different. In 2013, it was a by-election because Nigel had temporarily stood aside. And that was a very, very heavily fought election. There were 7 candidates. And it was at a very quiet time. There wasn't much going on in the world at that point. We can't remember such times. And it was a very heavily fought election and very, very stressful. The others were not. They were perfectly nice.
Oh, that's good to hear. Rosie?
Really nothing to add to that. I agree with everything Ellen has said.
Okay.
And I know you want to move on to other things.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Nigel?
Well, I was the first to be elected in 2010. John Bercow decided that they weren't going to have smoke rising from some chimney in Westminster and the names being announced, which was what happened up until then. So I was really pleased that they were having elections for the first time, and I phoned Lindsay Hoyle, being my neighbouring Labour friend, and I said, listen, I'm thinking of standing, how about you? And we both agreed that we were going to do it. And Lindsay actually said, I hadn't really thought about this. Yeah, why not? And that's what we did. And let's just say, I think the campaigning was somewhat different in 2010, when Lindsay and I sort of had a LabCon pact. We spent a lot of time in Portcullis House, and we drank a lot of tea and coffee, because we just glad-handed a lot of people, because that's how it was, just bumping into people that you knew. And I think I put 1 piece of literature out, but it was nothing fancy. It didn't go to an official printer, as I recall. The second one, if you recall, was the winter election of 2019, and I was in Australia. And I spent a lot of time getting up at 4 a.m, texting and emailing my colleagues who clearly were not at Westminster because it was Christmas. And I found that to be rather effective, and I got my nominations, people who agreed from all parties to support my nomination. And it's only when I got back that we had a very small window to campaign. And yes, I did get something officially printed and handed it around the tea rooms, but a lot of it again is knowing the people that are there. You've got a very small electorate, let's be fair. It's only 650 minus yourself. Well, I did vote for myself, so 650. And so it's, you know, it's basically friendships that you've built up for as long as you've been a member of Parliament. And it seemed to work. And yes, I did do my 500 words saying what I was going to do should I be elected as Deputy Speaker.
Thank you so much. Graham, I think you've got some questions about hustings.
Yes, thanks. So obviously, as you've described, very different elections that you all had at different times. Can I just ask each to briefly describe whether or not you undertook any hustings events, either inside or outside Parliament, what they were like, and if anyone found them useful at all?
We did. I don't think we did any hustings in 2015 or 2017, and I don't think we even did in 2020, but back in 2013 when it was a by-election, and that was of course something new because as Don and Natascha were telling this, and he started in 2010. So 2013 was an unusual and unexpected situation where it was Nigel who had to be replaced, so the candidate had to be from the opposition. I mean the government. What were we then? I mean the government.
You were in government then?
The government.
Sort
we were.
Sort of.
No, I have to admit I never considered the coalition to be government, but there we are. That's another matter. The candidate had to be from the government party, and yet the entire House voted. And there were hustings then. I remember appearing before the 1922 committee and appearing before the Parliamentary Labour Party, also in front of the Liberals, but that was just a little meeting and perfectly nice. So there was very heavy hustings then. And as to was it useful? Mm-hmm. Actually, I think it was useful because I know that when I stood in front of the Parliamentary Labour Party, there were a lot of people who I didn't know and who didn't know me. Mm-hmm. And so I think the hustings was actually quite useful.
I can't remember doing any hustings. But I think Eleanor's quite right to say that, you know, there is some use in it, because I think particularly when you've got a new Parliament and new members who don't necessarily know who it is that they're never met the person that they're supposedly voting for, then there probably is quite a good chance for people to ask the relevant questions and understand a bit more about what the deputy speakers actually do. Whether they would want to go to the hustings is another matter, because people at that point are extremely busy doing a lot of things and maybe think it's not at the top of their agenda. But I think having the opportunity to do it should be a bit of a must. And remember, in one of these elections, I was the only person standing for the Labour side.
Yeah. In 2010, the first elections ever, there was a hustings. And I thought it was really useful. It wasn't overly crowded in the hustings room that we were in, and even some of the MPs turning up had an open mind about who they were going to vote for. So it wasn't totally loaded in favour of one person or another. In 2020, there wasn't, because they said there wasn't enough time. And I agree with Rosie and Ellen. I think actually having hustings is an important thing, so that people who don't know the candidates are able to ask whatever questions that they like. And there may be things more important to some MPs than others, and so why not give them that opportunity? You can meet as many people as you like during the relatively short period of the campaign, but I think having a proper hustings is a proper thing to do.
Okay. Lee.
Thanks, Kat. Can I ask if you think whether a longer period between the closing of the nominations and the election taking place would actually impact the election process or the candidates at all in any way?
Yes, I think it probably would. Longer than what? You said longer. You see, in each of these, we're really talking about 5 different elections that have occurred. Each one was in different circumstances. And it's hard to make a comparison. And just before I finish, actually, if I may, Madam Chairman, there are some other points that we would very much like to make, which you didn't cover in the last session, and which are more fundamental and possibly very important.
Okay.
If we come to that.
Absolutely. is the points you'd like to make about the elections for deputy speakers. That's fine, and they weren't covered in the previous session.
No.
In that case, it might be, whilst it's on top of your mind, now might be the opportune moment to make those points. Then, shall we break from Lee's question and hear your points?
Well, thank you. It's the fundamental issue is that the election of the 3 deputies together on one ballot paper doesn't work. It just simply doesn't work. Because you don't actually have 3 people competing for one. You don't have, well, it isn't 3. Supposing you have 10 people on the ballot paper. You don't have 10 people competing for 3 jobs. You have 4 people competing for 2 jobs and the other 6 people competing for 1 job. Yeah. And it doesn't work. The example I would give you is that in 2015, my name appeared on the ballot paper along with Natascha, Engel and Lindsay Hoyle, but there was no other Conservative, so I was elected unopposed, but my name was on the ballot paper and I had to get some people to vote for me, otherwise it would look like nobby no mates. So, and as Natascha told you, she didn't want to be chairman of Ways and Means. Lindsay was the obvious person to continue being chairman of Ways and Means. And so that was also not a real comparison. So it was a very strange election. And certainly it was actually quite embarrassing for me to have my name on the ballot paper because everybody said, well, there's no point in voting for Eleanor because she's elected unopposed, which is true. There was no point at all. I'm surprised I persuaded anybody to put the cross there. But it doesn't work. And the other way that it doesn't work is that single transferable vote, a lot of people thought that if they were voting 1, 2, 3, 4, they were choosing 1 who they wanted for chairman of Ways and Means, 2 who they wanted for the 2nd position, and 3 who they wanted for the 3rd position. And that's how they thought they were voting. So lots of people would come up to me and say, yeah, I gave you number 2. I put number 2 because obviously Lindsay's going to be chairman of Ways and Means. And I think, yeah, no, that's just not... It's total confusion because the system doesn't suit the practice.
I completely agree. And so I think they should be separated into, if the Speaker is a member of or was a member of the governing party, then, as you know, you've got the Chairman of Ways and Means who would be the opposition, and then the first deputy chairman would be the governing party, which was what I was after Lindsay was elected, yes. And then Nigel was the 2nd deputy chairman. And I think you've got to separate those out. And if people argue, well, what if there was only one person who was, as in my case, I was the only person standing, I mean, you could say, well, you could still have an election in case everybody said, well, we don't want that person at all. But certainly separate them out, because then it's clear exactly what you are voting for, without doubt.
Yeah, I'd endorse all of that. I mean, it was ridiculous. I said to Eleanor at the time, you're the only nomination, you really don't need to campaign, and let's just throw all our support, behind Lindsay and all that sort of stuff. Because the demarcation of the various positions, as Rosie's just explained. And it was a bit dull, and Eleanor quite rightly said, well, what happens if nobody votes for me, if I don't campaign? So it does seem to me if you're the only candidate, it should be no election. You are declared the winner. And as far as the other positions are concerned, they're separate from Chair of Ways and Means. So, and it would be a lot easier if you had single transferable votes then for the 2 bits. It's so complicated, a system that even I didn't fully comprehend. And I know I'm not really good at maths, but I couldn't comprehend the voting system as it currently stands. It's complicated.
Anecdotally, that is something that we've had made to us by colleagues from this time's results as well. Bambos.
Just to come in on that, I got elected in 2017, and I think there was a vacancy for a Labour nominee for Deputy Speaker, and Rosie, my recollection is you were the only candidate for that. And
no, 2017 there were two candidates. 2020 there was only one. It was kind of 2019, 2020, wasn't it? Yeah.
And I thought that there was just no vote for that one. It was just yourself, and that was the.
Yeah.
Because actually I have to say I had huge arguments with the clerks in 2015 because of the embarrassment of having my name on the ballot paper when nobody needed to vote for me, and I think that by 2020 the clerks accepted that and Rosie's name didn't appear on the ballot paper, and there were only however many of us there were, and it was all government members at that point. And then everybody, that was quite straightforward because you had whatever it was, 5 or 6 candidates and the top 2 were going to be elected. So that was pretty sensible. Yeah. That election worked, but it only works where the two sides of the house are not mixed up on the ballot paper.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about only government members being able to vote for the government. We're talking about the whole House voting for everybody on all the occasions.
And incidentally, that's terribly important.
Yeah.
Because it has been suggested somewhere along the line that perhaps Labour people should vote for a Labour candidate and Conservatives and minority parties for etc., etc. But that would be totally against the principle of the authority of the chair coming from having been elected by the whole House.
Yeah. I realise that some of colleagues, I'm not going to come to some colleagues who may have been expecting me to come to them because I feel like that you've covered quite a lot of ground with that, and that's really helpful, so thank you so much. But I do think we could maybe ask Tracy, you could come in with your question.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So similar to the question that I asked your colleagues, given now that we have more women MPs in the House, up at 40%, and we have the 3 deputies who are all women, do you still think it's important to have the process in place to secure at least one woman as a deputy chair?
Yes.
And indeed, one man.
Mm. That's the rules, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, by default, there would, if there's...
Yeah, well, I think it's important too, and it was great when Eleanor became the first female chair of Ways and Means after how many centuries?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's ridiculous. But I think the rule is important, as Eleanor emphasised. There should be one of a different sex, which is what you've got. And I think for the first time ever, 3 female deputies now and 1 male speaker. So... yeah, as long as there's one representation there, I think that works.
Thank you. Yes.
I've seamlessly resumed the chair in Kat's absence. I'm now going to ask Michael to ask his question.
Thanks, Chair. So I understand that one of the concerns raised with our predecessor committee around the introduction of elections for deputy chairs was that it might introduce a partisan element of friction within the Speaker and Deputy Speaker team. In your opinions, from your extensive experience, was there any hangover from competitive elections? Was there any element of friction? Was there any downside to the introduction of elections for Deputy Speakers?
No.
No.
Absolutely not. No, we've been electing a Speaker for how long? And if you think about it, once the Speaker is elected, they give up their party credentials immediately. And there's never really been any problem that we've come across because of that. And it's certainly reacted as a great team, I thought, together,
absolutely,
both in 2010 onwards and 2022.
Yes.
Clear. Thank you.
James.
Thank you. So thinking back to your time as Deputy Speakers and the kind of time pressures and the amount of work, and I'm aware you were all in the chair during fairly turbulent times at points, do you think there is any value or need for an additional speaker given the work pressures? And the second part is, if there were to be a need or a 4th deputy, given the kind of rise in the size and the numbers of some smaller parties and independents in this parliament, whether reserving that fourth space for not from the two main parties would be of value. If it were, would that cause any problems with the team or the cohesion of the way that the system works?
I think I'd better make a point here, if I may, Mr. Chairman. You will all know that Sir Roger Gale served as an additional Deputy Speaker for part of the last Parliament. That was because I was very ill and had to be covered for, and Dawn explained what happened when she was absent in hospital and everybody covered. But let's just be blunt about this. John Bercow spent an enormous amount of time in the chair. The current Speaker spends a perfectly reasonable amount of time in the chair, but he has a lot of other things to do as well, which are important. So it was important to have somebody else there to cover when I wasn't there. And when I came back, the Speaker and Sir Roger agreed that it was a good idea that Roger was still there sometimes so that I could be eased back in gently. I think that when I say it, I would rather not bother going into all of this, but those were unusual circumstances. And we all feel that 4 occupants of the chair is right. Yeah. We don't, in normal circumstances, need another person.
I mean, I'd just like to pick up on something that Natascha said. You know, the balance is very important because you've got His Majesty's government representatives, if you like, His Majesty's opposition. They balance each other out in voting terms, in balance terms. And when it comes to the representation of the minority parties, you know, in many ways, it is the job of the Speaker to make sure that minority parties have their shot. And, you know, I think we would all be very aware that, I mean, the speakers that I have worked with did go to some lengths to do that. We have daily conferences. Absolutely. And if there are times when minority parties may wish to put in an urgent question or whatever, that is dealt with in its own way. I had some discussions with minority parties. This was raised with me by somebody who said, what about having a 4th Deputy Speaker from a minority party? I think the other thing to remember is that sometimes those parties can be very small. When you're the Deputy Speaker, you can't vote, you can't speak, and so to take out one of your members, when I sort of explained to the person in question, they said, oh, I hadn't really thought of that. Of course, you know, they want to have maximum representation and ability to put over their views in the House. There will be some parties, perhaps nationalist parties, who do not want to participate in the running of the House because the idea is to get, you know, clear of it, really. So I don't think, and I think it might have been either Dawn or Natascha who said, you know, you're not there to represent a particular party, and so how would you make that balance? So I think, as I say, it's very much the job of the Speaker to make sure that, and the Deputy Speakers to a certain extent, but most of the job of the Speaker to make sure that they are represented. And I think it would just be very confusing to have a 4th one. What you couldn't do in times of need, and I think this happened when the emergency recall, because I think one of the, somebody from the Chairman's panel stepped up to chair bits of those. And you could maybe have a system where that was more recognised, that the Chairman's panel could nominate people that in time of need. But it's very important that that kind of goes on the order paper so that people have the opportunity, you know, the House passes that as a way of, because that's what happened with Roger. Every time his period of time was extended, it had to go through the House. So you weren't sneaking somebody in, you know, it was a decision of the House. It was a decision of the House.
We consider it, in the past, we considered it an intrinsic part of our job to make sure that the minority parties are properly represented. It's actually something you have in your mind the whole time. But also, don't forget, you know, it's as the balance between the Speaker and the deputies is balanced across the House. It isn't Labour and Conservative, it's government and opposition. And the minority parties are part of the opposition. And at the moment, one of the minority parties is extremely large in the opposition. And there would be nothing to stop a Liberal Democrat standing to be Deputy Speaker. Absolutely nothing at all. And so that would work.
Yeah, I remember once receiving a letter from a constituent who said, Mr. Evans, I've always considered you useless. And since you've become Deputy Speaker, I understand you can't vote and you can't speak in the House of Commons, so now I know you're useless. I thought it rather unkind, but nonetheless I saw their point, and there is heavy responsibility with anybody who wants to go into the position of being a Deputy Speaker. You do give up quite a bit, to be honest. But the other side is you've got 3 deputies and the Speaker. You've got a given number of hours in the day normally. It's way more regulated than it used to be when I first joined the House in 1992. Mr. Chope, you well before then. We used to sit with the Maastricht sittings in 92 until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. That's why each of the deputies had a bed on the premises in order to accommodate that, just in case the proceedings went on well beyond 10 o'clock. Now, it hardly ever goes beyond 10 o'clock, and mostly everything's finished by 7 on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and 5 on a Thursday. And the amount of time we were in the chair, the rota sort of works. It's two and a bit hours each. And if somebody is temporarily incapacitated, I remember once there was an interview going on, if you remember, and I think it was you, was it? Anyway, it was a deputy and Lindsay were on the panel to select whoever it was, the clerk that they were selecting, right. And I had to sit in the chair for about 5.5 hours on the trot, and it was before COVID, so there was none of this order, we will desanitize the dispatch boxes and then you went to the toilet. There was none of that. You never stopped proceedings, it just continued as it was. How John Bercow carried on during the Brexit stuff for several hours at a time, it was almost against biology, I should imagine, that you're able to do that. I certainly couldn't do it. But it seems to work anyway, so I would have kept it as it is. And Eleanor said, there's nothing to stop, let's say after the 2029, if that's when the next general election is, and some of the parties are much more closer together, then maybe a position will be taken that a party that's currently not represented as a deputy might wish to give it a go.
Lovely, that was incredibly helpful, thank you.
And there's nothing, just to clarify, there's nothing to stop one of the smaller parties nominating somebody as an opposition speaker. That's open for them to do that if they want to.
Absolutely. But it's very important to bear in mind that you're not elected to the chair to represent anybody. It's not a representative role. You're there to help the speaker carry out the duties of the chair, which is a quite different view from anything to do with party political stuff.
And as we have Sir Christopher here, who did preside over the sitting Saturday for a period of time, would you like to give us some of your thoughts of that?
Well, I think the system works. It's flexible. I certainly wouldn't be in favour of having any more people. I think 3 deputies and a speaker is more than sufficient. And what Edward Lee and I, when we were appointed at the beginning of this Parliament to deal with that interregnum between the election of the speaker and the need to appoint 3 deputies by election, and there was a gap, and that, I think, interregnum went on for about a fortnight. But going back to the earlier discussion, I don't think it would have done anybody any harm if it had gone for 3 weeks, because we're talking about electing deputies for a whole Parliament, and so I don't think that the time constraint should be the main consideration in having a proper election with hustings.
Yeah, I think, am I right in saying, I mean, there was some pressure to make sure that things were sorted sort of before the King's speech or Queen's speech?
Well, in 2020? I think a view was taken that it should be done as quickly as possible. But
Yeah.
I take on Chris and Lee's point that maybe there should be a given number of days after the election when you actually say, get time for the hustings, get time for people to look at the situation you've just had with the huge influx of new members of Parliament who really didn't know some of the characters involved who were putting themselves up for election. Yeah. More of a time, hustings would have given people a greater opportunity to gauge who the right people were for the job.
I mean, in this Parliament, the deputies were appointed temporarily up until the end of the Queen's speech, or the King's speech debate. So we had the King's speech debate, and then that was the best part of a fortnight really after the House had gone back. So
we have a division now, so the meeting is suspended for 15 minutes for a division in the House. And if there's more than one vote, it's for a further 10 minutes for that division as well. I'm not expecting more than 2. So hereby suspend the meeting. resumed, and it says here I will hand back to the member who was in the process of asking the question when the division bells rang, and suggest to do so again, but I think we concluded that question, so I'll move on to the next question, which, by strange coincidence, is from me. So this question is about select committee chair elections. So we had reports of excessive canvassing by some candidates for these roles as select committee chairs. And I just wondered if you could give us your recollections, if this was an issue when there were votes for select committee chairs in those elections.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's not something that actually affected us as deputy speakers. And I don't recall being aware of it in that capacity, but I do recall being aware, it must have been just after the 2017 election probably, that there were elections for committee chairs, and you could hardly see the table in the tea room because of the amount of paper there. And if all these people who said they cared about the environment had actually not wasted so much paper, it might have been better. More importantly, I have picked up concern that because of, once again, the way in which the voting system is constructed for chairs of select committees, it has been suggested, and I couldn't give an example of this, but it has been suggested that sometimes the government party would vote for the person who was likely to give least trouble if they became the chair of a select committee, and maybe because they might not be as good at it as some other candidate might be. And if that is the case, then that would be a pity. And at the same time, the opposition parties would vote for the person who was likely to cause most trouble and be most awkward, rather than the person who could actually do the job. Now, that may or may not be the case. Simply throw it into the arena.
More about the process, about the way the elections are run. Do you think that maybe a deputy speaker overseeing the process, maybe as a returning officer, would be a help or a hindrance?
I don't know that there's any particular... Is there a lack of trust in the process? I've never been aware that there's been any sort of lack of trust particularly.
It's more about the policing of the process to make sure that things are... that the excessiveness isn't so...
Well, I mean, there may be a case for saying, as in, some party selections, that you can produce a statement and one piece of supporting literature, so that it doesn't give an advantage where people might spend, an awful lot of money, and that could make it more equal. I mean, I think in the Labour Party, that's the system now, isn't it, for selections, to prevent overspending.
I don't think it's overly problematic. As Eleanor said, having the tea room full of leaflets, it almost becomes counterproductive in the end. And if you keep pushing too hard at people, then that's counterproductive too. I would tend to agree again that if you wanted the deputies to do anything, I would get them to oversee the APPG elections to ensure that they had the requisite number of people coming and it was all in order, rather than the chairs of committees, where select committees, where that seems to be well regulated and well ordered.
I think that is.
I think that it does happen.
Yes, I think that is happening, isn't it? Certainly, it was the intention at the end of the last Parliament.
It was the intention, yeah.
Yes, because I had some kind of duty in that respect, but I didn't have a chance to exercise it because the election came along. But actually, we were just looking back to remind ourselves about some of these elections and remembering about that booklet that was produced by the House. Maybe it would be a good idea to do that for the select committee chairs. But as to overseeing returning officers, etc., the clerks are extremely good at that. Well, in my experience, the clerks are absolutely made for the job and very good at it.
We're now going to go on to look at call lists and other things that happened in the last Parliament. So the next question is also from me. So in October 2020, I think you all gave evidence to our predecessor committee and outlined a number of issues that had arisen from the operation of call lists during the pandemic. So looking back, what do you see as the key challenges posed by the introduction of call lists? And to what extent do you think that these challenges posed by or exaggerated by other changes to the usual behaviour and courtesies of the House, such as the relaxation of the requirement to be present in the chamber for opening speeches or most of the debate to have on the on call lists?
It was dreadful. It was awful. It was amazing that we kept Parliament going during the pandemic. It was amazing that it was done. And Mr. Speaker and all the clerks who worked really hard deserve enormous commendation for having managed it, and I hope we helped. But it was dreadful. Don't let us ever let Parliament turn into the creature that it was during the pandemic, where people made 3-minute speeches which they read not even from a bit of paper, but from behind their screen, so they couldn't see. They couldn't see the chamber. We were sitting in the chamber watching whoever was speaking on a screen like that, and then you realised that they'd all caught on to it somehow or other, that they didn't have to be looking at anything except their speech in front of them, so you could see that they were reading a speech. And it would be 3 minutes, and of course it was a great pleasure to cut people off bang on 3 minutes if they went on. only because if you've got something to say, you can say it in 2.5 minutes. And once you go on past that, it's good to stop you. But joking apart, it completely changed the nature of debate. There was no debate. There was discussion. There was holding government to account. I do believe that was done, and it was done adequately. But as to debate and Parliament performing its proper function as the heart of our democracy, it was gone.
I mean, I think there's quite a lot to need to understand what happens when you're in the chair and you have a list of people in front of you, although, of course, we always say there isn't a list. There is guidance for each other as to what order people should go in. And we can come to the situation in the Lords, because some people have compared it, and I think we could try to explain some of that. But, you know, when you're in the chair and you have your guidance list in front of you, things can happen. Like somebody can come up and say, look, there's a really urgent thing that's happened in my constituency. Could you please put me somewhere else, a little bit further down? I just have to go out. You can have a situation, particularly where there might be time limits in place, and you might like to discuss the issue of time limits, because we made the point previously, where somebody might constantly intervene and you're on a strict 5-minute time limit, and somebody has intervened on every single person before, and you think, well, hang on, this is not really fair, and I'm going to move you down the list, because not everybody is going to get in. You've taken a lot more time than everybody else, and so people might come up in the opposite way and say, look, I've desperately got to be at a committee between 5 and 6, and I would really like to be put in a position, and we will say, well, look, check in when you come back. I'll pass on to the next Deputy Speaker that you've told us that you'll be out and you'll come back. So the idea of the published lists, and any idea that, and we did try to enforce it, to say that people really did need to hear what other people had to say. We're not reading into the record, as happened during COVID, and then you go away and people may or may not have heard what anybody else has to say. But this is a debating chamber You know, it's not just reading something now and then going, and you do need to hear what the minister has to say and what the opposition as well. We used to make that point very clearly, that members needed to just wait and hear all the opening speeches and be back to the closing speeches, because they may be referred to. And it's really important, I think, in terms of the public perception of Parliament, that they think there is a listening to each other.
Absolutely.
And when you go to the Lords, and there is a call list system there, but remember, in the Lords, the Speaker and the Deputy Speakers do not play any role in calling people or monitoring the debate. It's what's called self-regulating. So there is a list published, and people very rarely in the Lords intervene on each other, which is so it's much more relaxed, if you like. So there isn't that same intervention, and so it's much easier to have a call list in those circumstances, and people do, I think, more tend to stay in to listen to what other people have to say.
Courtesy.
So, you know, to translate one to the other is, I think, unfair, and I think the Commons needs to preserve the idea that it is the deputy speakers and the speakers have a role to play in managing the debate.
Yes.
And you can't manage the debate if it's already decided where exactly everybody is going to speak. And I think it would that's what happened during COVID, that everybody knew when they were going to speak, but it wasn't a debate. It wasn't a debate as we understand it.
And it's developed over the years. When we were first elected, you wouldn't dare ask the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker where you were on the list. I mean, you wouldn't dream of it, because if you did, then you would find that you weren't on the non-existent list. You just had to sit there, so we have been much more relaxed about these things and tried to be helpful. But if the House requires the deputy speakers to prove why they were right in calling so-and-so before so-and-so, then the whole system falls down. There has to be trust.
And I think in the Lords as well, am I right, Ellen? I think in the Lords, we don't sort of have an end time. So you get through the list, so you can go on forever.
Yes.
And the speaking time, as it happens, is only advisory. Yep. It's not implemented. The deputy speakers cannot implement it in the Lords. So, and sometimes people will say, well, hang on a minute, no, it's only advisory, so I'm going to speak as long as I want. And so if the Commons wants that as well, you know, which I suspect, because there are so many more votes, you know, the Commons likes to know when its votes are coming, by and large, and the fact that it does have an end time unless there are specific reasons to go beyond that. So, no, I mean, we may be coming on to the time limits, but we have strong feelings on that, which we can share with you.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with the other two. I think having the flexibility for the chair is very important. Also, if people know when they're speaking, they're unlikely to turn up in the chamber until just before they're on, because we've got, you know, all MPs have got lots of pressures on them, and I think it would make the chamber of the House of Commons into a very sterile place, to be honest. Yes. I mean, I was on the Council of Europe for many years, and they use a list system there, and it's fairly sterile as somebody stands up, gives their 3 minutes, and then sits down. I mean, there's no interventions there at all, and I think the nice thing about Parliament is you come in, you listen to the openings, which I think is very important. That everybody who's coming in, and if they weren't in for the first, I think we gave them like 2 minutes, didn't we? If they weren't in for the openings, they didn't speak at all. And I think that is important, because you are responding to what the minister or whoever opens the debate, and that is part of what a debate is all about. And I just think that if you, I mean, I've seen the American Congress, and I think they must use a list system too. My goodness me, how sterile and boring is that? And
yes.
I think they can even read things just into the record, even if they don't give the speech. I mean, is that where we're going next? So I just think what we've got now works. It may seem inconvenient to people who would love to know when they are speaking, but I've got a good idea. If you're interested enough in the debate, don't just come in for your soundbite. Come in for the debate. You know?
Yeah, and there used to be a system when we first came in where people would never mind be moved down, they could sit there for 8 hours and not even get to speak.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there were and that was considered to be perfectly normal.
It was
in 1992, I sat there for several hours and didn't get called. Some of the best speeches, Mr. Chair, I never gave.
We look forward to reading those in.
The other thing, the other side of this coin is that it's very important that new and inexperienced members understand that they're not meant to speak on everything every day. That's not how Parliament is meant to work. And let's put Jim Shannon aside here because we all love Jim. We all love Jim, and Jim is sui generis. It's just him. Taking everyone else into consideration, it's not reasonable for people to give their constituents the idea that they'll be posting a speech every 2 or 3 days. And that they'll be putting something on Twitter or Facebook that they've said in Parliament every 2 or 3 days, because it's not reasonable, because not everyone can do that. There's 650 members. And there's an expectation, some of which is driven, dare I say it, by lazy journalists who want to find something to criticise or who don't perceive matters as they really are.
You've kind of answered most of the next question. I wonder if Graham has any follow-ups on that he'd like to...
Yeah, just picking up some of those points that I think have been well made, but do you think there's two questions actually. One, do you think there's any kind of hybrid system where you would try and prevent someone, where you could prevent someone coming in for just their 3 minutes and leaving again, so the chamber was still active? You could have some kind of where there is a call list or an advisory list that is published, but that the chair's right to move that around remains. Something which is hybrid.
No.
And sorry if I can
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I would never interrupt a deputy speaker. And I think the other issue that we could find, this is anecdotally being told to me, and I'm sure to other members, is that MPs, as you say, have draws on their time, and so therefore deciding to spend 6 or 7 hours in the chamber to perhaps not get called is a decision they may choose not to take, and then you're ending up with the chamber being far more empty than I think we'd all like it to be. So it's how we find a solution to that problem.
Well, you said hybrid, you're looking for a balance.
Mm-hmm.
That situation you described, where someone would sit for 6 or 7 hours and not get called, I have not experienced in the last several years. I was in the chair for 10 and a half years. We're talking about what it was like 27 years ago when we first came here, and of course it was difficult for Rosie to get called because her party had a huge number of members of Parliament. Ours had hardly anyone. We got called all the time. So remember, that comes into it as well. But in recent years, I can't think of a time when someone has sat for 6 or 7 hours and not got called, because after the first 3 hours, they would have said to their whip or to the occupant of the chair, have I got any chance of getting in here? And any of us, being reasonable, would have said, look, the way it's working out, the chances are you're not getting called. Would it be better to withdraw your name and come back next week?
I just think things have moved on, haven't they, from the time when we were first elected, right? In 1992, it was under Betty Boothroyd and Michael Martin and their deputies. And there would be there was this thing about seniority. If you were a Privy Councillor, you got called first for everything. And the time limits was really incredibly novel. There was none of this 3-minute time limits in those days. If they put a time limit on, it was 15 minutes. Can you imagine that? I mean, it was boring. And a lot of it was like foreign affairs debates or defence debates. And I remember sitting in one where I was there all day and I literally was and just didn't get called. So you're saying about any sort of hybrid. I think the answer is in the time limits that have been introduced, which give people the opportunity to make a point. They may not be able to meander for 15 minutes as they used to before, but quite frankly, they can get a point across in the 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on how many people who want to speak in it. So I think there has been an answer to the issue that was a bit of a problem when I first got elected in 92.
I mean, I think you can also think about this the other way around, and we discussed this quite a lot, which is those people who choose to speak a lot. You know, there is... it's not entirely fair on others who then choose not to speak all the time because they end up being penalised by only having a short time to speak because we tried to get everybody in. Yep. There is a real issue as to whether we tried too hard to get everybody in because that meant that everybody and the people who judiciously thought, I'm really interested in this particular subject, I'd actually like to have a fair amount to make a speech. Yes. And we would look at the number of times that people had spoken. Sometimes people would come up to us and say, why am I always called last? And it's because you try to speak on everything and it's not fair on other people. On everything. You've spoken on everything and it's not fair on other people that they're not getting a fair whack. So, in a sense, and people can tell because when they go into a debate, and this is something that the chair always says, don't think just because you've put your name in, you have to keep bobbing. So somebody looking around them will think, hang on a minute, I know that I've spoken at least 5 times in the last week. There are 50 people standing. Should I not be going up to the chair and saying, why don't you pull my name from the list? Because I know that I'm going to be at the end. You might be down to 2 minutes and I'll have sat here the whole time. So, I mean, that is another way of looking at it. We have almost gone from one extreme to the other. And then that comes down to the issue of time limits and how that becomes part of managing the debate, because that is another part of exactly that question.
And as to, you asked about the publication of a list. Do you know, I will go as far as to say that suggesting that a list ought to be publicised is sort of saying you don't trust the deputy speakers. It's really important that the House leaves with the Speaker and the deputies the authority of the chair to manage the debate and doesn't tie their hands by something artificial such as publishing a list. Rosie's explained to you how it works in the Lords. It works because it's a completely different setup. It's a self-regulating House and it's completely different. We understand, sitting in the chair in the House of Commons, that sometimes there'll be a debate about something which is really important to certain constituencies and not really very important to other constituencies. And we know that, and we would make sure that the people who have a serious constituency interest and whose constituents will be watching to see what they're saying will get to speak, whereas somebody who just speaks all the time will not get to speak when it's a short debate like that. And there has to be a trust in the chair. And if it was suggested that it really wasn't being done properly, I don't think anybody ever really suggested that.
See, if you did publish, people would come up and say, I don't understand why I'm there.
Yes, that's
right. And then somebody who will come up to you and say, I've really got a personal problem or something, can you move me? If you had a draft list and then started messing about with it, they'd say, well, why, I don't understand why that person has come up. And then you'd have to start saying, well, it's because X, Y, Z. You'd have to start explaining about other people's difficulties, which would not be appropriate, whereas you can exercise your judgment and do it. And remember, in the Lords, with the published list, you have to put your name in. I think it's almost now 2 days before. Whereas in the Commons, I think people are used to, at the last minute, saying there's been a development in my constituency and I'd really like to get in on this debate. I haven't spoken at all in this session, and you would say, I've got it, we'll put you.
And you don't have to have done that in advance. It's perfectly proper to be, as long as you're there right at the beginning of the debate, then you can indicate that you want to speak. And also it can happen, this is an evolving place, and we mustn't allow there to be so many rules that it closes down effective debate. It's perfectly proper to come in at the beginning of a debate, sit and listen to the debate, and suddenly realise you do actually have something burning to say because somebody on the other side, or more likely someone on your own side, has said something absolutely ridiculous that you want to counteract, and you only decide then that you want to speak. And then you start to bob and go up to the chair and say, "Could I speak?"
I think the
and you can.
The evolutionary bit of Parliament in, as I said, 32 years I was an MP, and some of you are going to find this really difficult to understand, but in 1992, if you wanted to make a point of order during a division, you had to put one of those opera hats on in the chamber. That was only modernised in 1998. So things do change, and I think the change should be for a good reason, not just for the sake of change.
Going back to, we've touched on this, but time limits. So we've talked about call lists, and obviously time limits are the bane of anyone who's like at the bottom of the pile, making their 5-minute speech into like a 2-minute speech, or shorter sometimes. In our predecessor committee, Emma, you mentioned that injury time should not be added for interventions when there's a time limit of 5 minutes or less. Do you still think that? And if so, why or why not?
I'm so glad you asked that. So glad. We all are very glad that you asked that. I had forgotten that had happened. It had become obvious to us and to Mr. Speaker that it wasn't fair, that if you had half an hour left and you had 10 people and you said, right, okay, you've each got 3 minutes, and you send the whips round to say, you've got 3 minutes each, let's do it. And then one of them would intervene on another, and he'd intervene back on him, and they do it simply for the reason of adding a minute to the speech. So we suggested, I think I wrote formally to the chair's predecessor, Karen Bradley, asking for this to be looked at, and the procedure committee was minded to support what we had suggested, but unfortunately Sir Christopher isn't here. My recollection is that when it came to the floor of the House, Sir Christopher objected to it and it didn't go through.
I mean, the argument about that is you're stifling debate. But we were very clear. We weren't stopping interventions. We were just saying, if you, with your 5-minute limit, choose to take an intervention, then you just have to take that within the 5 minutes. So it's not stopping debate. It's just saying, that there are you need, in order to be fair to other people. I mean, I can't quite remember whether we said this, but I mean, I think there is a certain case for at some point saying, a 5-minute limit is the lowest you can go, and then people have got an idea that they may not get in, but they will then be put down and recorded as somebody who didn't get in at that point, because some people say, I just simply cannot say something in 3 minutes, I've sat here all day. So there is that option. And within that, you can say, if colleagues want to be fairer to each other, even though the 5-minute limit cannot go any lower, if you stick to 3 minutes, then you'll be helping others.
Yes.
We would sometimes do that if we'd got 6 people and there'd been lots of people intervening, so they'd stretched their own term, and the poor people at the end were only getting 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and we'd say, look, you know, if you could stick to 2 minutes 90 seconds or whatever, then you can all get in. Sometimes people did that, sometimes they don't.
Always remember that the reason the people at the end are at the end is because they have spoken so many times. And we try to be fair on that.
Yeah, and some MPs were gaming it, as Eleanor said, where I remember one Tory MP intervening on another, and he said, will the honourable member give way? They gave way, and he said, I just thought I'd give him another minute, and sat down, and that was it.
Juvenile.
It was awful.
Dreadful.
I know some colleagues want to come in, but before they do it, can I just clarify? Rosie, did you suggest that there should be a maximum of a 5-minute limit? Or
I think it's something that can be considered. You know, if you said, maybe 5 is too long, maybe 4 or something. That if people said we really don't feel, if everybody had not really spoken very much during a parliament and they all wanted to speak in a particular debate,
That'd be without injury time.
The injury time thing, coming back to your question, we feel very strongly about, and we were very disappointed when the recommendation of the Procedure Committee in the last Parliament didn't go through the House, because it really would have helped. If we, as Rosie said, we were not suggesting for a moment that there should be no interventions, merely that when the occupant of the chair got to a certain point and said, right, we're on the 3 minutes now, there'll be no injury time, then it would change the pace of the debate.
I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as something that, because you've got to judge the mood of each particular parliament, and people might say, you know, we feel that actually people ought to be given at least 5. They don't always take 5 minutes, but they ought to be at least given that opportunity. But I mean, that is something that is just another way of managing the situation.
I'll take Michael, and then I think Lee also wants to come in as well.
Okay, no, thank you.
Okay, Michael.
Thanks, Sharon. Just to potentially press on this a little bit, as someone who has occasionally in a debate found myself towards the bottom of the non-existent list, despite being not an incredibly frequent speaker. I think it's fair to say that it's a real and apparent problem when people are donating time to colleagues who are ahead of you. I agree with your assessment there, and I think that it's valid. But I do want to press, because whether or not our colleague Christopher expressed a previous opinion or not, I think it would be the valid counterpoint that, you know, we do not want to stifle debate, and the practical outcomes of procedure in this case would be as a potentially severe deterrent to people taking any sort of interventions. So I do want to press on your assessment from your experience of being in the chair. Like, there would be a dampening effect on interventions, but do you think it would potentially be a severe disincentive to donate some of your time when you don't know how long that time might be for the intervention?
No, well, my own opinion is, no, it wouldn't have a dampening effect, and that actually, you know, also not that long ago, people didn't read speeches. You get up to make a speech with a few, that would be quite a lot of words on a page for a 3-minute speech. If I were making a 3-minute speech and had that many words, I would cut those ones out and just do the ones at the top and the bottom, because you'd have to get it in 3 minutes. If we get to the stage where members of Parliament are not capable of making a speech off the cuff, but have to have every word written down and have it timed to 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 8 minutes, then we're losing a quality of debate there that's to a worrying extent. So that it should be that however short your speech has to be, if you want to take an intervention, and you're not going to get a lengthening of your time, you ought to be able to take an intervention and say, either I totally disagree, the honourable gentleman is completely wrong, or my honourable friend makes a very good point and I'm glad he's had the opportunity to make it. Well, how long was that? That's 10 seconds.
If I might, just before other views, because I do want to really press on this in case it becomes an issue, because
yes.
I might agree that we should and we might, but in terms of a practical impact upon the chamber and the real psychology of our colleagues, do you not think it would have any lessening of willingness to take interventions?
No, I think, this is only my opinion. I think that the more cut and thrust, short speeches, interventions, quick points, cut out the and in my constituency of blah, 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 because I want to mention my constituency's name as often as I possibly can. Right, so that's taken up, half a minute? That's not necessary. Take that out and make your point. That makes for a much better debate. So no, I feel quite strongly about this. I don't know whether...
I think you've got to recognise that, the other thing that would sometimes happen is that people would come in at the very end of the debate, not having sat there listening to what anybody else had said, and just think, oh, well, this is quite a good wheeze. I'll just get up and intervene.
Yes,
and then I'll have my name in, what your MP does for you or whatever it is, because you've intervened. And that used to infuriate me, because I thought it was so unfair on the other people who'd sat there patiently.
Yes.
Even though they may have spoken on a lot of other occasions, so hence why they were low down the list. There are some strict rules, obviously, because if you've referred to somebody, you would almost be obliged to take an intervention.
Yes.
People will often, a colleague might say to you, I'd really just like to have the opportunity to intervene, and you might say, okay, just very quick, because you're both making the same point and you want somebody to back you up. If people are challenging, so I think it has to be viewed in the sense of whether it's being used to game the system or if it's a genuine toing and froing, and sometimes it will depend on how long it is left, and probably if it's a 5-minute limit, an intervention can be easily, but 3 minutes, people are giving away quite a lot to do that.
When you're down to the 3 minutes, it means you really are pressed for time. And we try to fine-tune it so that we leave time for the minister to respond or the shadow minister. And if it's one of those debates where somebody else has introduced it, that they get 1 minute at the end and all that sort of stuff. So we try to fine-tune it as much as we possibly can. Doesn't mean people shouldn't intervene. And it could end up with people stifling, saying, well, no, I've only got 3 minutes, I'm not taking any interventions at all. But I've seen that with people on 5 and 6 minutes saying, no, I haven't got time. So I think that it may lead to pithier interventions, people making their points way more quickly. But really, when the chair comes down to 3 minutes and you're trying to fine-tune it, you are trying to be fair to everybody who's in the chamber, and some of them may have sat there a long time,
Thank you, Vol.
We've got just a few more questions to go, but it'd be helpful if people could speed up with questions and answers. So, Mary, over to you.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks, Chair. And just it's back to what the arrangements during the pandemic. But before I do say that, I think in my defence, I was one of the intake that came in 2019. So we had about 12 weeks of what seemed normality, and then it was changed to online. So I'd give my maiden speech, and then the next day was lockdown, or the next week. So then my first question to a minister was at my dining room table on Zoom. So that's what, and then if we had speeches, we were given a time limit, so that's probably why we started then reading off the paper, because if you didn't, you press the button and you're gone, sort of thing. So you had to make sure that you got everything in, and we were new and then experienced. So I don't know whether some of that started from that time where people have their speeches written out and they
Yes.
follow it word for word.
You
Don't know,
did.
but yeah, in our defence, it was a very strange time, indeed, for newbies. So, but carrying on that theme, in terms of the remote voting at that time, the remote voting was put into place for just a very short period of time, if you remember. Did you think that remote voting had any particular challenges to you as as chairs? For one, that's one of the questions.
At the time, sometimes there were technical problems.
That's all, yeah.
But that's all. Yeah, that's all. And in fact, our technical people were brilliant at being on hand and sorting it out. It was just if there had been any suggestion that it was going to go on for any length of time, then that would have been awful. But the fact that it was getting us through the pandemic and through a serious emergency situation, it's amazing that we did it at all.
Mm. And I remember the lines as well when
The
we
conga.
went back into social distancing.
Yeah, the conga.
Yeah. It was
Is it
around
congaed out of
Hall,
Westminster
the
Hall?
lines, Yeah,
That was ridiculous.
But again, for new people, it was all normal for us. And moving on from that, then from the pandemic, those things that were put in place, we did then have the in the division lobbies the pass readers,
Yes.
which of course we've kept up with that. And it's the teller's count that provides that result to the House. So do you think if the House were to move to a fully electronic voting system, do you think there should still be the role of the tellers?
Do you mean you don't mean remote voting? You mean
Electronic.
you just mean electronic? I don't.
Oh no, we've moved that. So the pass readers do remain. But were the House to move to a fully electronic system, because that is one of the things that we have been
Does that mean
looking
not
at.
going through the lobbies though? Is that
On your phone?
Yes, the fully electronic, where you can do remote voting if you're somewhere on the estate. Do you? Because that's something that has been touched on. Hasn't it? That's
That
on the
would,
modernisation.
again, that would be one of the things which would change the character of the House of Commons, and I would say change the character for the worse, significantly worse, because once again, I've seen some of the things that new members have said in their ideas about modernisation. I think it would have been humble of some people to perhaps spend 6 months here before they started saying that what has developed over 300 years is just wrong. There has to always be evolution, but there are good reasons for the way in which things are done. And I don't think the actual, using your pass to register your vote is any problem. Is in the division lobby, it's fine, and you still nod to the teller, and the teller still counts the votes, so it's instant. The tellers then are responsible, and it's backed up by the electronic bit. You're suggesting that possibly, for example, the division that occurred, whatever it was, an hour ago, you would all just have got out your phones and voted. I would seriously suggest that would mean that you, as members of Parliament, would miss out on an essential part of being here in Parliament and in the House of Commons, which is meeting your colleagues and ministers and others in the division lobby and talking about whatever you wish to talk about, and all being in a parliament, a place for speaking all together. That's just my view.
Look, as a former minister and a former chief whip, I can tell you, when you've got to go through the voting lobby and you are going to meet your colleagues in the lobby, and you know that somebody who has raised something is going to grab you. I mean, how often do you say to to your constituents, I'll make sure I see them in one of the votes, and I will take that up with you. You know, that the ministers have to come to the House in the same way. It's really important for ministers to have to, in my view, to have to do that, because you always used to, as I say, go, I'd better better find the answer, because I know they're going to grab me when I go there. That interaction is absolutely vital, and for the opposition, because in the lobby afterwards, you know, the opposition members can go up to ministers and say, look, you know, you've sent me this reply, but I really want to pursue this X, Y, Z. That, as Eleanor says, talking, interacting is really important. And you know, from a whip's point of view, you may not want to hear from the whip's point of view, but it is quite good that you know that people are coming along and saying what they feel about different issues. And you don't get that if they're sort of thinking, well, I don't really need to come to Parliament because I can just vote, you know, somewhere else. And what would... I mean, I think there may be something to be said for perhaps, because I think this is what we do have in the Lords, if people have got proxy votes for very particular reasons,
yes,
rather than having a proxy do it, that they might say you can check in and vote that way, because but that, you know, that's just a suggestion, because some people just think, well, you hand it over to somebody who just makes up their mind what way you want to vote, and that might be different. But I would not give away the going through the lobby easily if I were you.
When I'm touring Americans around Parliament, I have to spend some time explaining why it is we don't vote where we sit and all that sort of stuff. And it's quite difficult for them to get their heads around it until I explain to them why we physically vote and the importance of physically being in a lobby, and if you're on the government side, being able to pin a minister to the wall and say, why are you closing my hospital? Why have you stopped the money going into the schools? All that sort of stuff. And having that ability for just a few minutes, and they're not surrounded by their civil servants, I think is really important. And I'd think long and hard if I was a member of Parliament before giving away that privilege. I really would. And I'm more Neanderthal than Eleanor. I would wait not just 6 months before I made any decisions if I was a newbie. I'd wait 2 years and try and work out why it is that this practice has existed so long before I want to reform it. And I remember Janet Anderson and I, for those of you who remember Janet, when we started altering the hours of the House. And because we used to sit beyond 10 o'clock most nights. During Maastricht, we used to sit till 2, 3, 4, and we actually went right through the night. This is way before the Jopling reforms. That was never clever, absolutely. But then all of a sudden, truncating the day to 7 o'clock on a Tuesday and a Wednesday was giving away a lot of time, which meant that you then had to work out whether you sat on a select committee or you were in the chamber if you had a question. You made that decision because the day was truncated because of that. And I remember Janet and I got, they made the reforms, but we got Tuesday back to 10 o'clock. That only lasted until the next Parliament, and they went straight back to 7 o'clock. So I would just, my own advice would be, hold on, why do they do it this way? Yeah, get rid of the top hats, because that was old hat. But voting in person and getting that, maybe that only one opportunity to pin a minister against the wall, or even a shadow minister, or seeing somebody you haven't seen all day, because MPs are really busy. Their diaries are packed full of seeing people from the time they get up till the time they leave Parliament, and getting a time to chat to your colleagues, doing a bit of plotting in the voting lobby. You can't replicate that. Not even a WhatsApp group can replicate that.
No. It's actually more about it's actually not about the actual physical voting that's at stake here. It's what else happens in the voting lobbies.
I think you asked the question about tellers.
The tellers.
I think the tellers. The important thing about the tellers, because we used to have that it's still, if the pass readers crashed, your tellers would say, well, these are the number of people who went through. Exactly. And if the tellers, it's a check. We have that in the Lords. We have tellers.
Absolutely, we have tellers.
So I don't know how that would work. If it did go fully electronic, what role would the tellers have? How
exactly.
would you do it if you're not actually physically through?
And if something then goes wrong with the electronic system, then you don't get the result of the division because people are, everywhere. And if people don't want to be in the chamber, taking part in debates, voting in person and talking to other MPs, why do they want to stand for Parliament? It has worried me a bit when I saw some of the suggestions that came forward on modernisation from new members at the end of last year, and I came to the conclusion that quite a lot of people have been elected against their will. Such a pity for them, because there was always someone else who would have liked to have been elected instead.
You've pretty much covered the next question, unless Lee's got anything he wants to...
I was, very specifically on your learning, if that's okay, Baroness. Is that the plural for Baronesses? Baronesses? I don't know what the plural is, Baronesses. Eleanor and Rosie, if I may. Just in terms of people with long-term disability, and your learning from the Lords in particular, I understand that you can actually apply, if you have a long-term disability, to vote online or by telephone, whether you're on the estate or off the estate. Could you ever see that being replicated in the...
That's what I was trying to say about you've got the system of proxies, and you
so
could maybe replace that with...
Okay, so you can see that happening in that particular situation.
You'd have to have a very... there is quite a strict system of saying who can have that proxy and who can't.
And I think that system is already in place, and it's very specific circumstances.
Yeah, but you could, but as being deputy speakers, you could see that being replicated in the Commons in those very specific circumstances.
It is already.
It tends to be for people who can't get through a particular reason rather than... I don't think there's a kind of long-term... When you say people with disabilities, or do you mean people who are simply not well enough at a particular point to come to Parliament?
I'm not talking about illness, I'm talking about people with a long-term disability. So what examples have we had in the past where we've talked about here? People that maybe have an illness that is degenerative, and we know it's degenerative, and it gets to a stage where they can't come in, but they can still perform their duties, but have to do that
way.
That
would be the case for the proxy. I think I was just getting slightly confused whether you were saying that somebody with, long-term disabilities that they'd always had, that person might say, well, Parliament should find a way of accommodating me to be able to get through the lobbies in the same way as everybody else does, rather than saying, well, you've got to go over there and have an electronic vote.
And Parliament has gone a long way in accommodating people like that. You haven't seen Rob Halfon zooming around on his what's it called, like that
mobility.
But it's a standing up one. It's really Segway. That's what I'm trying to say. But certainly there's absolutely no harm in accommodating people in a very specific position. And of course we've come a long way now that we say that pregnant women are able to have a proxy. Absolutely correct. I remember struggling through the lobbies. It was horrible. And it's so we've come a long way on that, and that doesn't do any harm. Because what the distinction is, what you're talking about there is a specific person with a specific problem.
Absolutely,
who can always be accommodated because it's one person out of 650. What goes wrong is if there's sweeping changes that affects everybody without having...
Can I just make one add-on on this, which is, and I don't know whether changes have happened in 2020, but when I got into legal difficulties, there was no exclusion. I kept coming in and I kept voting. There was no problem. Things have moved on since then. And a number of people since that time are told, please don't come onto the premises. Mm-hmm. And I think that their constituents deserve the opportunity to be represented in voting. And we're talking about proxy votes. And yes. So I may be talking out of turn as far as whether changes have already occurred on that. But I do believe that those constituents still ought to have the opportunity to have their votes counted during that process. So that may be one area where some investigation could take place.
Thank you.
Last question to Graham. You've kind of answered this a little bit.
To be honest, I think they've answered all of it during that answer, so I have nothing else to add to that, to be honest, Chair.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our speakers today, so our deputy speakers, I should say, former deputy speakers. So Eleanor, Rosie, Nigel, thank you so much for coming and giving evidence. I hereby want to...
Thank you very much indeed for inviting us. It's very touching that you want to know what we say.
What we think.
What we think.
Is anything further that you want to add? Any, if you want to put forward any answers in writing later, then please do so. Forward them on to us in due course. So thank you very much. So I hereby want to conclude today's proceedings in this evidence session. Order.